Hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Nick Kanoki, the Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I'm very excited for our conversation today with James Downs, Asset Management Executive at Definitive Logic. Before we get underway, we just want to thank our patron members, especially Definitive Logic, as well as our other organizational members that you see here before you. We are grateful for their continued support as they make programming like this in our newsletter possible. So thank you again, and thank you especially to Definitive Logic, this week's sponsor of ALN Thursday at 3. And now I'm going to bring in Mike Bordenero, Executive Director for the ALN, to talk a little bit about the next time that we'll meet here at ALN Thursday at 3. Mike? Oh, can't hear you, Mike. I'm gonna have to unmute you there.
Okay, there I am. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone. Next week, obviously, we'll be taking a break. And then December is a special month where we'll be focusing on advancing outcomes with asset leadership. That was suggested by Jack Dempsey from Definitive Logic, who's also one of our board members. I wanted to focus on policy. After our event in Washington, D.C., it became clear that policy is what leaders do, and we should be talking a lot about policy. But policy isn't very sexy. Outcomes are. So we'll be talking about advancing outcomes with asset leadership, knowing that leadership sets up policy. And our first event on December 1st will be with Jack Kelly, another board member, Jack Dempsey, and our ALN CEO, Jim Dieter. And they'll all be talking about the specific ways that asset leadership can advance outcomes. Then the second week in December, we'll be speaking in a panel format. All of December is going to be 1-hour programs. It's not just going to be a half hour like usual. And we'll have an hour panel, and Chris Chen, who is the executive director of the Ontario Asset Management Group for the province of Ontario, Canada, will be one of the panelists, and we'll have other folks from Canada talking. And then the third week, we'll be having a conversation with the folks who wrote the asset management policy for Portland, Oregon. So that'll be an interesting exchange. And then I believe we'll be having a Christmas party on December 22nd, but stay tuned for that. I'm pretty sure it'll be a ugly sweater ALN Thursday at 3 or something like that. We'll make everyone turn their cameras on. But anyway, enough about that. We have already been getting feedback about this program before it even started. James, when people saw the little blurb announcing what you have done, people were saying that's a lot of assets you were managing. So I'm really excited to be talking with you, and I think we'll probably go into overtime because there's so much to discuss. But can you give us a relatively quick version of how you got where you're at now? I've looked at your LinkedIn resume, and it's, it could be a half hour just talking about what you've done in your career. It's quite impressive.
Well, yeah, that just leads partly to how old I am, but that's, so I got my degree in civil engineering through Air Force ROTC scholarship. And so upon graduation, I went to an assignment in Air Force Civil Engineer Squadron at an installation. The Civil Engineer Squadron is the unit that's responsible for facilities, infrastructure, also some emergency response and that sort of thing. And so throughout my career, I was at many different bases, mostly at Civil Engineer Squadrons, and then also I did an assignment at a major command. So that's overseeing a major command oversees multiple installations. So then it's a matter of looking at how do you prioritize requirements at installations that are very different, perhaps very different, weather patterns that drive very different requirements at different times of the year, that sort of thing. And then about 9 of the last 10 years of my career was at the Pentagon, at the headquarters Air Force. And so at that point, it's about, strategy and policy. We were just talking about policy. And about half of that time, though, was spent very focused on planning, programming, budgeting, execution, the PPBE process within the Air Force, which feeds into the Department of Defense, and ultimately the submission of what amounts to a 5-year budget, but the focus is really mostly on that first year. So a lot of experience or time spent dealing with facilities and infrastructure, a large portion of it out in the field, with whether that was meeting someone in the middle of the night as they were trying to take care of a gas leak or a power outage or whatever, or planning for the future. So the Civil Engineer Squadron is about, that's planning, overseeing design, overseeing construction, and then the maintenance and sustainment of all the facilities and infrastructure and that sort of thing. So again, a large portion sitting out in the field. And so I think a lot about, as we, the asset leadership network is about approaching this from a leadership perspective, which is central, right? You've got to start with why. You got to have that strategy and the strategic approach. But then how do we operationalize it? So that's what excites me.
Well, sorry, I hear there's feedback from my microphone. I apologize for that, but hopefully you're not hearing it. Anyway, so thank you for your service, by the way. That was quite a trajectory you had, and it was quite extensive. So then it came time for you to retire from the Air Force. What did you decide you wanted to do with your experience, and why did you pick Definitive Logic?
So as I started talking to Definitive Logic, as the end of my career approached, I talked with folks, and you mentioned Jack Dempsey earlier, folks like Jack that are very excited about this subject in particular. And then, what Definitive Logic does is take experts like Jack or others across different disciplines and really marries it to technology. And Definitive Logic doesn't make software. It's about developing and configuring, or data engineering. We have expertise in all different cloud platforms, that sort of thing. So it's about taking and infusing that technology into delivering capabilities, either that aren't already there for a customer or aren't there as much as they could be. And that really drew my attention because, throughout that roughly 29 years in the Air Force, especially later in my career, as I was looking at it from different perspectives and kind of across the entire board, I saw a lot of opportunities that we couldn't take advantage of. And part of it was because, technology was evolving, but we weren't evolving as quickly enough to take advantage of it. And so I think, as I saw the kinds of things that Definitive Logic has already done, and the kinds of vision that the company has and leaders within the company, that really excited me as a way to, just again, spending a lot of time looking at it from an Air Force perspective. But I know that the Air Force experience is not unique.
Well, I really love the way you put that. And the technology is moving fast for everyone, not just for government agencies. And that is almost the biggest problem, or the biggest issue, is how do you understand what's available and digest it? And I'm really convinced that policy has to be the way you go. If you don't have a culture of asset management and understanding that you're trying to achieve the mission and use the newest, latest tools without disrupting processes, that's the challenge. And so I think it's great that you had that perspective and saw definitive logic addressing it and chose definitive logic.
Yeah, and I think, within the federal government in particular, with the 1-year budget cycle and having to respond to that so quickly, and asset management really being a long game, right? I mean, it's about, when we're talking about life cycle of facilities and infrastructure in particular, the flash to bang on investment is pretty long. So how do you know that what you're investing is doing the right thing? Well, certainly some modeling and some technology, and there's lots of opportunities to help provide decision makers with better ways to make those decisions. And so, yeah, my experience with the PPBE process kind of helped give me a slightly different perspective, kind of, because asset management, and you talked about policy and we talk about strategy, that's foundational. You must start with that or you're not going to get where you need to be. But operationalizing that and then taking and using it for the communication purposes. So there's an inside the family conversation and there's the outside the family conversation. And within the PPBE process is where I got to experience a little more. I got to see things from someone else's perspective a little more. And that was nice, being in what's literally called the Air Force boardroom and being in that room for many, many, many hours and hearing the conversations and the justifications behind, is it more important to spend money on fixing facilities or buying another F-35 or the next round of tankers, or, and how do you have a conversation where you can really prioritize that and be able to express value and describe risk, which again, it gets to the foundation of what asset management is able to give us some common lexicon.
So that's helpful, but what else did you learn there? What was motivating decisions? It's not summarizable, but if you can give us a general idea of some of the things from inside that boardroom without giving away secrets or anything, obviously, just general ideas.
Well, obviously the military focus, that's the priority, is the mission, and the Air Force, and I'm confident all the services do this. They are trying to look out past the headlights. They're trying to. You can't develop a new weapon system or new technology overnight. You must plan for that and think ahead. But there's the constant tension with the political nature of how resourcing is done, and that's okay. That's the way the process works. But there's being able to describe the risks and the military, I guess outcomes is a way to put it, but how each of the different investments or the lack of investment, as we talk about risk in that room, we're usually talking about risk means you're not going to fund something. But that's, I would say that's where most of the conversation really focuses is how does this move the Air Force forward? How does this, make us more ready to face X, Y, or Z threat or perform certain missions?
Excellent. And then how does that translate into what you're doing now on the civilian side? You're still doing some consulting with the Air Force. Can you tell us about the part you can tell us about that, and then how your Air Force work seeps into what other work you might be doing also?
Yeah, so one of the projects I'm been most involved in is actually not asset management specific, or at least from when I'm thinking asset management, I'm thinking about facilities and infrastructure, real property generally. But our financial management practice has several large projects, one of which is actually in the PPBE process within the Air Force. So the Air Force had a 50-year-old database of that data, and Definitive Logic configured a new system for them. And so I spend time in the Pentagon each week, a couple days, 2 or 3 days a week, and interacting with customers, helping them try to ensure that they're able to look at that data in a way that helps to drive the right decisions, the best decisions, the most informed decisions. And so it's not what I'm thinking of traditionally as asset management, but it's certainly similar in lots of ways, of course. But yeah, so I
in 2016 we came. In 2016, we came out with the statement, data is an asset. So as far as we're concerned, you are doing not only asset management, but you're doing asset leadership. That PPE part is, in the Air Force boardroom, is the leadership part of the asset management.
Yep, certainly.
So then what other ways are you able to use your Air Force experience with other clients, and how do you see it translating into other areas?
Well, there's certainly many opportunities across the federal government, because, you talked about whatever it says on my resume about the number of assets and that sort of thing. But when you have an organization that's global, that has a presence all around the world, has those facilities and infrastructure all around the world, and is trying to make the decisions that are applying resources, whether that's time or money or whatever. Well, clearly there are many other agencies that do that. We're doing some work with the U.S. Postal Service, and some of that actually involves not only owned facilities and infrastructure, but there's the lease component as well that I didn't deal with as much within the Air Force on what I focused on. But it's also, it's about delivering capability, and whether that's insourced, outsourced, or whatever, there are just decisions that need to be made to prioritize those. So that that's an example of other places across, and Definitive Logic has some commercial works in some commercial areas, but does a lot with federal government across the federal government, and again, the Postal Service is another example.
So we've got a question here about deferred maintenance. Do you see that throughout federal agencies?
Well, yeah. Certainly. It's when I use the phrase operationalizing asset management, setting the vision and having the strategy and the leadership, that's critical, but the people that carry that out are the ones that are either doing that maintenance or being forced to defer it for one reason or another. And sometimes that's time, sometimes that's money. And so ensuring that the asset management culture is infused throughout is what's going to make it completely successful. I guess, Mike, I had shared with you an anecdote that we had a visionary general within Air Force Civil Engineering back in the 2007-ish timeframe, and he really embraced asset management. And while there was certainly asset management going on, it was definitely not formalized, and it wasn't necessarily looked at holistically. And so there were a lot of changes that happened. There was, we began a transformation, and some of that was forced upon from the outside forces. There was some reorganization that needed to happen. Well, if we're going to reorganize, let's do it smartly and that sort of thing. And so one of the decisions that was made was to actually bring the word asset management, or the phrase asset management, into the organization. And so at every civil engineer squadron, there was a flight within there. So there's different flights perform different functions. And there was one that was entitled asset management. And while introducing that phrase was a very good idea, I think there was the unfortunate consequence was that anyone that wasn't in that flight assumed that asset management was somebody else's job. And so I think there's a way to I get back to the, how do we communicate this, and how do we make it part of the culture? How do we make it integral and not additive to what we're doing on a day-to-day basis? So as that technician goes out to fix the broken HVAC system, and they replace the belt, or even just doing basic maintenance, and they do the changing a filter, clean a filter. Well, if they believe it's important to take the extra 15, 20 minutes or whatever it takes to actually do a condition assessment or update the current condition assessment for that piece of equipment, that allows that person to make a better decision down the road on that maintenance, on whether, when we're talking about deferred maintenance, or it makes the leadership within that unit, helps them make better decisions. And ultimately that rolls up, that's part of the much larger conversation as it rolls up to the headquarters Air Force level. Because unfortunately at the headquarters Air Force level, I was talking about a big chunk of money. Well, it's really hard to tell that story without the objective sort of data behind it. And I'm pretty sure that the ALN has seen the installation health assessment sort of information that the Air Force had worked up. Now, I wasn't involved in developing that, but I was involved in using it to tell the story, because that helps to put more of a face on what we're talking about, from again, out in the field where it matters, to Washington, D.C., where the decisions ultimately get made on how resources get allocated. There's the local decisions. So you have a certain pie and you need to figure out how to slice it. But there's also discussions that need to be had about, is that pie the right size?
Yes, we have had, we've been very fortunate to have many presentations by the Air Force. And the general, I think you're talking about, his last name begins with an E, and I can't remember it, but he's presented.
General Yulberg.
Yulberg, yes, he is presented.
Yeah, and, there was many transformational things happened because of his leadership.
Yeah. And we found out that the Air Force considers their facilities an extension of their war fighting machine, and therefore look at facilities in a way that other entities do not do, because the Air Force is rightfully proud of being a leader in aircraft asset management. You have systems in place to make sure that every pilot returns from every mission, and you do so much work to ensure that. And then if you take that same approach to your facilities, then you're elevating yourself. And from what we've seen, the Air Force is a leader in federal government asset management all the way down to the runways.
Yeah, absolutely. There is absolutely an understanding across the board that, every Air Force mission starts and ends on an Air Force installation from Air Force facilities. And whether, if that's a actual aircraft, talking about a runway and the airfield pavement and the airfield lighting and the tower and then, but there's also a lot of cyber missions. And then you're talking about power and HVAC, how important those are, as important as a runway. And so, the Army has very critical facilities for actually some of the same sort of thing, but also, they're about move and maneuver, right? It's about, their mission is somewhere else and they're headed to it. The Air Force, the installations, are the platform from which those missions happen.
So then how does that translate to other agencies or other organizations? Do you have any advice on how to take that mentality, that culture, and let's say a dairy or a chemical plant, or how can others internalize that military readiness approach?
Yeah, well, I think the outcomes that you're looking for are quite different, but the the capabilities that are needed are so similar. I mean, the dairy, without the power, without the water, without and the roof and the facilities and the infrastructure, that mission, again, it's about that mission, and that mission can't happen. And the other thing I know that the ALN has heard, I'm sure Jack and others perhaps from Definitive Logic talk about the mission dependency index. And that's a very important part of helping us to make those decisions. And so in a dairy, the power perhaps is, is part of that. The mission dependency is very high. Perhaps the waste management is very high importance for that to be able to continue to operate the way it needs to operate. Being able to identify that, again, it's the facilities and the infrastructure are foundational. And again, I would say looking more broadly at asset management, it isn't, I generally talk about fixed assets, but there's the equipment or personal property sort of things that, whether that's vehicles or other equipment that are also central to that. I think you're muted. Yep.
Yes. So I said that we're probably going to go into overtime, and we've got a couple comments here that I know are going to just bring us into overtime. So I would like to have Nick come on and wrap things up a little early. And if there are people who are on a tight schedule and have to leave at the half hour, they'll be able to, but then we'll be free to kind of just talk off the cuff after that.
Awesome. I will just briefly bring back these slides so we can thank our patron members as well as our other organizational members for making this sort of programming possible. We love to do this every week with always inspiring people to talk to, and we hope to continue that with your continued support. So thank you again, and especially to Definitive Logic for being this week's sponsor and for James Down's participation here today. And with that, we'd just like to say we hope to see you in December for our Advancing Outcomes with Asset Leadership series. And back to you, Mike and James.
Okay, James, let's go with the quick one first, because there's a really juicy one here. Couple, actually. Oh, and of course, it's from your colleague at Definitive Logic. I don't know if you see the chat. But first, David Brewer from Jacobs, who is a former Air Force staffer or officer himself, says understanding risk of failure is critical. And I'm sure he's saying that's just not for the aircraft, but like you were saying, the roof or electricity or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. There's the consequence of that failure, being able to articulate that. It was always a challenge for us because we have, government civilians and uniformed airmen out in the field making sure things don't fail. So there isn't a long laundry list of facilities and infrastructure failures, but if it does, what is that risk? What is the consequence? And being able to articulate that is very important. And the mission dependency index helps us with that too, because the failure of certain things may not be as catastrophic as others.
And then your colleague, Jeff Freemeyer, asks, what do you see as the biggest challenges to asset management and instituting better technology to mature decision-making? And Jeff, I think that's a great summary of what Definitive Logic does. But I'll let James answer that.
I think, so I use the term operationalizing asset management, and I talked about those out in the field and how it's important that what they're doing, it becomes integral to it. So technology can help tremendously with those decisions that need to be made, but it can't be burdensome on the people that are trying real hard to take care of stuff. It needs to help them make their decisions. Then it's valuable to them. It helps make decisions all along through the entire organization. But I personally think that's one of the challenges is, as I've seen, as we've tried to do certain things, we talk about condition assessments, and I mentioned if there's a way for that to be part of kind of just your day-to-day, what people do, using technology to do that is very helpful. But if we do what we've done in the past, where we send a large team to an installation and they do a complete assessment of facilities and infrastructure, and they mark all that down and leave, and then a lot of things change, but assessments aren't kept up to date. It becomes less and less useful over time. There's a challenge in infusing technology in that, but there's a huge benefit.
Okay, and then we've got a question from John Wyatt, and I'll just read it. I'm a professor teaching asset management to undergrad and grad students. He focuses on government contract property at Cal Poly, and he's going to be heading up, he's going to be one of the co-chairs for the ALN Higher Education Asset Leadership Board. And he asked, what would be core competencies in asset management that would be expressed by a new hire candidate that would impress you in potentially hiring that candidate? So this takes you back to when you were a civil engineer, or now that you know asset management, what would you look for someone coming out of an asset management program that would make you want to hire them?
Wow, that's a great question. And the fact that there are asset management programs is a part of the solution, frankly, but just in and of itself. So one of the things that comes to my mind, and it's not necessarily a competency that someone could come right out of school with. I think it's an important competency that is developed over time, and that's being able to have a strategic view of the situation. And again, I think a lot of that comes with, is developed over time. But that's something, as I moved along in my career, what's the phrase, where you stand on a subject is largely based on where you sit. Something that's, as I was at an installation, I could not believe the poor decisions that were being made at the major command. Well, then when I went to a major command, I had a different viewpoint, and then I could understand how those decisions were being made. And then, and different at the headquarters Air Force, yet again. And so again, that's not something you're going to get directly out of a textbook, but an understanding of that importance. And sometimes we put together some great strategy document, and I'll say from my experience, we put a lot of time and effort into strategy documents that look awesome, and then they go on a shelf, or they, it needs to be part of the culture. It needs to matter throughout the organization. And so I think if that could be called a competency, is being able to understand the importance of the strategy and embrace strategy and figure out, what does that mean to me? I didn't go for 4, I think was the question, but that's one of the first things that came to my mind.
I think that's really well stated. And we have done programs with Cal Poly, with John White. And what we do is the scenario building. So we have the students say, all right, we're going to do something right now. And it's trying to give them a realistic view of how to think strategically. So we're trying to encourage that strategic thinking, even straight out. But then I also like your point of basically get with the mission with, if you can learn to get with the mission, that's going to help you a lot when you go into a new job.
Always start with why. But the and the other thing I guess that may be perhaps a little more pertinent in areas that I struggled with throughout my career was being able to articulate risk and articulate value to that more external stakeholder. So if I'm talking to a fellow civil engineer, there's no question how important this, it is to do this type of maintenance on a facility. If I'm talking to an F-15 pilot, that person is more focused on making sure that landing gear is good, or and rightly so, but being able to articulate risk inside and outside the family, so to speak. So I think, I think that's something that would be a competency or something that could be, from the very beginning, being able to look at it that way. Because again, I didn't necessarily look at it that way. I mean, some of that is intuitive, but being able to truly communicate it is not.
And John wonders if part of what you're saying is to be able to think critically.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's really what it's about. Sometimes when we are within our own organization or our own part of an organization, it's kind of like an echo chamber. We agree strongly. Well, if we're not being critical, we're not able to communicate that. And we need to think critically in order to, and by the way, the other thing I definitely learned was about, we need to do the right thing, not necessarily just what's right for me, is also part of that conversation, right? And so critical thinking is absolutely vital to doing that.
So then we've got a question from Carmen. And how do you get leadership to understand that their decisions regarding asset management affect their responses to emergency situations when their mindset is focused on those emergencies? How do you get them to see the components assisting in their success is based on results of good data? That's almost two kind of questions. But clearly there were emergency situations in the Air Force and you had to think about how to deal with asset management. So do you get an idea of what they're looking for there?
Yeah, and I'm not sure this is exactly answering Carmen's question, but one way, and this is a pretty tactical scenario, but it's think about the potential emergency situations before it's an emergency. We used to talk about, when you show up at an emergency situation, that's not where you want to exchange business cards. You want to have had the conversation ahead of time. You want to think through that. You want to talk about, what's the worst case? What's the most likely case? How do you, approaching that emergency situation ahead of time before it's actually an emergency. And then some of those an understanding of what you're doing and the decisions that are being made, or the decisions that need to be made by the leadership, there may be a better understanding. And that's kind of, I'm not sure if that's really getting after the question that's being asked, but that's certainly what came to my mind as I heard it. And then
again, that's more of that scenario planning and doing drills, etc., and right, preparing for that emergencies ahead of time. How do you see them to get them to see the components assisting in their success is based on results of good asset management data? So that would be, again, going through a drill ahead of time where you learn to trust the data. And you don't have to have something blow up to pretend like it's blown up and then say, how many people are here? What resources do we have there? And going through these scenarios builds trust is one way I could see. I don't know.
Yeah, and I guess I would I would say to turn back to the technology infusion discussion is a digital twin can come into play, could be very valuable here. If you're able to, you can see the situation with, and it's not going out in the field exercise or doing drills, and it's much more than just doing a tabletop. It's about being able to really understand, because all of this is a multivariable equation. And if you can have something like a digital twin that can really show the impacts of changes to multiples of those variables, that can really help with all right, so if we focus here, this has the biggest impact on reducing that risk. And again, looking at it from the glasses half full perspective, this has the most increase in value if we're talking about just making decisions.
One of our other patron members, Onuma Inc., created BIM storms, which are, basically the original digital twin scenario planning. And Jack Dempsey was involved in that through the Coast Guard. They did a lot of Coast Guard BIM storms. And so maybe we need to have a BIM storm session next year. And then I'd like to end this with the question we haven't asked before. We said, how did you get where you're at in your journey today? Well, with you, I'm really curious, where do you see yourself on your asset management journey in the future? Where do you want to do it? How do you want to use your skills and services to guide your journey? And what do you think that looks like?
Yeah, I guess what I'm most passionate about is infusing asset management throughout the organization. And I think about those craftsmen in the field, and I love the scenario that was presented at the session here in DC about the engineers had come up with what they thought was the solution, and brought in the people that actually were out in the field doing the work, and said, what do you think is the solution? And they, based on their knowledge, they had the right answer, and they saw that the engineers also had the right answer, and bringing them together. I think again, infusing technology throughout helps, but being able to ensure that all of those involved see the value, embrace it, and want to be part of that solution. I look forward to being able to take to fill some of the gaps I saw throughout my career, some of the problems I was never able to solve. I see ways to solve them. I see opportunities, and I'm excited to bring some of those solutions to the field. And again, I see that within the Air Force, but I have no doubt in my mind that there's very similar opportunities many places. And as an example, we talked about the university. Well, we often in the Air Force, as we looked at facilities and infrastructure, many bases all around, some similar, not necessarily the same. Well, universities, most don't have a runway, but other than that, they're very similar to an Air Force base, right? So, and if you talk about a state university system, all right, well, how are resources, how are decisions made associated with that? And so there's lots of similarities among different organizations that are responsible for large portfolios, and being able to, again, have that infused throughout is certainly a place I'm looking forward to going.
Well, thank you. And thank you for being there in Washington, D.C. on, that was September 16th, I believe, if time is flying.
Yep.
And that was the example you mentioned from the Department of Transportation,
Yep.
where they purposefully did the overlay and showed the field workers that their insights were what the engineers thought also, and that really married. It was an excellent exercise. So thanks for bringing that up. And thanks for joining us virtually from your awesome office
Well,
Drop. That's quite a basement you have there.
yeah.
And I really appreciate the passion you're bringing to the field and for sharing it with the Asset Leadership Network. So we look forward to including you in future programs, and want you to have a nice Thanksgiving, and everybody else out there have a very good Thanksgiving next week. And don't miss us too much, and come on back December 1st and start an hour long, where I'm purposefully going to be an hour for the month of December.
All right.
So thank you very much.